Thank you for this very detailed and I would say flattering introduction. So now we can proceed to our subject, and we hope to fit in quite a lot into the limited time space that we are allowed here. Our topic is the myth or reality of authoritarian resilience. The idea, the rather prevalent idea of today of a kind of authoritarian renaissance that is taking place in the aftermath of the previous wave of democratization, by which we mean a situation when many countries that used to or were thought to be proceeding in a democratic direction have now turned backwards and are exhibiting authoritarian tendencies, and also those countries that were autocratic are becoming more, as we say in political science, solidified autocracies with less internal competition and with less attempt to even imitate democratic institutions and procedures. So I would like to start with a bit of a definition of what we're talking about. In social sciences, we almost never have final and complete definition for any of our terms and concepts. That opens a wide field for anybody's creativity, because you can always come up with a new definition of whatever we're talking about. But that, I think, is the reflection of the complexity of these very things we're talking about. But for the benefit of today's discussion, I would say, at least on my part, that when we are talking about autocracy, we are talking about a political model where power is being concentrated. So an authoritarian tendency would be the one where this concentration of power is increasing. A democratizing tendency, on the other hand, will be more complicated. So when you have, in my opinion, an increasing monopolization, a concentration of power and resources in the hands of the few, the process that is known as an iron law of oligarchy, and that is supposed to be almost a natural tendency. Power tends to concentrate in the hands of the few. Then you can perceive a clear authoritarian trend. But it would not be correct to say that dissemination of power constitutes a democratizing trend. Democratization is not just the process where power is leaving its center. This may be the failed state process. But democratization is the process where you have democratic institutions being established or strengthened. With all the immense complexity of the very concept of democracy, with all the number of definitions of democracy that we have, I think the whole question can boil down to a rather simple one. Democracy is a political model where a peaceful transfer of power, not because of force, but because of procedure, is possible. It gets as simple as that. Can you get rid of your precious leadership without killing them? Or you can't. If you can do that, you are closer to a democratic situation. If you can't, congratulations, you are in an autocracy. Again, there are many other things that we can say about democracy. But if you don't have that central element, then you don't have even the beginning of a conversation about democracy. So, if we look at the situation in the world through this lens, what do we see? I have mentioned the iron law of oligarchy. It has been formulated by a German social scientist, Robert Michels, who studied German political parties in the 20s of the 20th century. So he discovered the thing that people have long suspected. In any organization, not just in any society, in any organization, power tends to concentrate. Let me repeat again, it seems almost like a physical law. So, jumping straight to our first point, or at least to my first point, I think we should not be surprised that autocracies survive and even enlarge their presence, but we should rather be surprised that democracy has emerged and sustained itself. Because in a sense, autocracy is a natural state of things, in the same sense as Thomas Hobbes described the natural state of man. You will remember the definition, it's unforgettable once you read it. The natural state of man is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. So that, according to Hobbes, is natural. All the rest is not natural, in a sense that it requires an effort. Democracy requires constant effort. It's a high-maintenance system. Not in a sense that it's expensive or available only to the rich. We'll talk about that, I hope, later, whether you do need to reach a certain level of economic development and, income per capita in order to afford democracy. But it is certainly high maintenance in a sense that it requires maintenance. You can't just do one fair elections in every 10 years and then have done with it. You can't just elect, even fairly and democratically, one good man to appoint all the rest. That is not democracy. But you have to make this effort always, on every level, every day. So it should rather be a wonder, and I think, pass this question to my esteemed core discutant, how such a complicated system was able to emerge, to survive, and to spread itself on the face of the earth to such an extent that today even autocracies, even the highly repressive ones, still imitate what they cannot get. They still do elections. They pretend to be ruling by the choice of the people. They have, more often than not, multi-party political systems. They have parliaments. Why do that? Why do they feel it necessary to pretend to be a democracy? So that, I think, should rather be a question. I would start with that, and then we can naturally proceed to discussing a more, I would say, concrete signs of either democratic or authoritarian renaissance, whatever we'll say we are witnessing.
Thank you very much. You have here one political scientist and a historian, and it's quite natural and I think quite entertaining for you, I hope, that these perspectives are not the same, and they very often complement each other, and sometimes you profit from constructive tensions, I would call it. Let me start by a kind of general observation. Why do we talk about the renaissance of authoritarian regimes right now? And I would like to start with one moment which I think for that story is extremely important, and that was the impression in 1989, 1991, that, in the words of Francis Fukuyama, the end of history had arrived. So the idea that an ultimate victory of liberal democracy plus capitalism had become some sort of global order. And one could argue that from this moment on, the end of the Cold War, the future seemed to be very open and very progressive and very promising. That's the main difference now. We also have a very open future, but it doesn't seem to be very promising and not very bright. Now, the big question which a lot of historians, particularly historians on Europe and the global world, discuss right now is how did this window of opportunity actually develop? You can approach that from a political point of view, looking at democratization processes starting in the early 90s and maybe ranging until, or developing positively until the early 2000s, maybe until 9/11, or you concentrate on economic developments and then the window of opportunity is maybe open until the first major crisis in 2008, or you start with discussions on identity and counter-identity, and you would then come to different chronologies. Still, it's important to see we are talking about a renaissance of authoritarian regimes because the impression of this open future, this promising future, has been shattered. And it depends on one's own experiences or the political or the economic benchmark, whether you define the end of this window of opportunity in the earlier or the later 2000s. Now, what has come instead, what has developed instead of this end of history? One could say there is, first of all, the big question, what is left of the West? Is there still one unified Western political model, or do we begin to question the validity or the legitimacy of the transatlantic combination of liberal democracy? We are confronted with internal processes of erosion. If you look at European integration, if you look at Brexit, if you look at what has been going on in Hungary or in Poland or in other member states of the European Union, and we have a kind of global development of counter models. And I'm sure we come back to that, not only in China and Russia, but also, for instance, in Turkey and Brazil. This is just a historian's attempt to contextualize a little bit this discussion we are now in. Is there a renaissance of authoritarian regimes? And from a historian's point of view, the history of democracy and the history of counter models always goes in waves. Samuel Huntington and others have tried to develop or to describe these waves. You can, for instance, start with three waves, the first between the 1820s and the 1920s, a gradual rise in the number of states, societies with democratic institutions, and then a second wave beginning towards the end of the Second World War until the early 1960s, very much coupled with the experience of decolonization and the defeat of fascism in Europe and authoritarian regimes in Asia. And maybe a third wave starting somehow in the early mid-1970s and then ranging to the 1990s or early 2000s, depending on what you look at. But it's also clear that you have counter waves, and I just want to mention the counter waves because for me as a historian of the 19th and early 20th century, they of course play an important role. One counter wave is of course the 1920s and 30s. A second is the period from the late 1950s to the mid-1970s, and then again the developments in the course of the 2000s. I just want to mention that because it shows that defining the history of democracy and authoritarian regimes in waves is nothing new for the historian. And it also means that we should be prepared for waves, that is to say, for critical moments, for regression, but also for the potential of resilience. I want just to briefly mention one particular moment, and that is the early 1930s. In 1931, the New York Times started a survey asking people in all major countries of the earth, what is the future of democracy? And the result of this survey is pretty negative, and not to say gray, it's black, because most of the specialists say democracy has no future. This is, of course, against the background of the Great Depression. It's against the background of the seemingly successful model of the Soviet Union, which has not this dual crisis of democracy and capitalism. And yet, a couple of years later, quite a lot of democracies in the United States, but also, for instance, in Sweden, in the UK, prove to be able to cope with this dual crisis. It's far from clear, but by 1945 it is clear that democracy will survive. It even leads, one could say, to a redefinition and reformulation of democracy. So my first statement is really be prepared for waves and be prepared for maybe even a dialectical relation between resilience and regression and resilience. One last point I would like to make, we talked about definitions at the beginning and or in the preparation of this evening, and I was hesitant because as a historian I tend to say that every concept that has a clear definition awaits history, because definitions have their own history. The definition of liberalism or socialism or democracy or authoritarianism has changed through history, so it's really difficult to define. But I still want to give a working definition which is open enough to include historical examples and which may help us to find some sort of orientation. And interestingly, I think it complements very much what Ekaterina has said. For authoritarian regimes, I would really like to mention 4 points, 4 characteristic marks. One is the suspension of checks and balances. A second is the suspension of civil rights. A third, very important, especially at the beginning of authoritarian regimes, is the questioning of the legitimacy of the political opponent. Because this is what makes compromises then really difficult. And the last point is, of course, the tolerance, if not the use of violence, including a kind of brutalization or militarization of the public. Now, if we turn to a good definition of democracy, I'm a big fan of Alexis de Tocqueville. When I read with one of my seminars Tocqueville a couple of years ago, that was 2016.
Democracy in America.
Democracy in America, exactly. People were a little bit hesitant. Why do we have to read this bloody liberal of the 19th century? Does he really have to say something? And then Trump was elected. And at the end of this seminar, people in the seminar could not be detached from the text any longer, because they read Tocqueville as somebody providing them with the analytical material to understand the present. Now, what does Tocqueville say that could be interesting for us if we discuss democratization and the renaissance of authoritarian styles? He mentions 3 things that are for him very important for the functioning of democracy in America in the 19th century. He first says there is a basic social egalitarian society. There is no American aristocracy. In a way, there is no European-style ancien régime. There is no estate-based legacy. Second, there are common habits, very important. Yeah? He looks at the Americans and he says they have something in common. They identify as Americans by their social behavior. And the third point is then what you know is look at town hall democracy, at the election of offices, at a strong federal system of checks and balances, a clear separation of powers between the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. But he until the end of his work, he insists that democracy is more than the ability for institutional change, and he looks at the habit, the mentality, what he calls mœurs, the kind of moral collective spirit in which a society functions. And I think we are certainly coming back to that, because any kind of authoritarian regime in a way has to get rid of all 3 elements. A certain kind of egalitarianism, a certain kind of a common habit, and the checks and balances in concrete terms.
But would you, as a historian, consider that authoritarianism is a kind of norm from which democracy has to develop? Or do you consider democracy to be, in a sense, as natural a state of society, in a sense that it comes naturally to a politicum, to a social body?
I'm not a fan of Robert Michels, who developed this iron law of oligarchy. Robert Michels studied the social democracy in Germany, and basically what he says is, once there is organization, there is oligarchy. And of course he has a point that structures, bureaucratic structures, institutional structures tend towards oligarchic structures, but a lot of historians have shown that, for instance, in the history of parties and also trade unions, you can include working checks and balances. So I'm not absolutely sure whether we can make it a kind of anthropological law. You could, in countering Hobbes, you could refer to Rousseau, or if you want to have a kind of realistic Rousseau, look at Immanuel Kant. So there are, I think, alternatives, and as a historian, I would argue in the course of the late 18th, 19th, early 20th century, the cost of authoritarian rule becomes more of a problem. The cost a political regime pays for being authoritarian, for referring to repression, to terror, to violence, is rising. That does not mean that there is a kind of uninterrupted progression towards democracy, but in the course of state building and nation-state building, the idea of regulated political participation becomes a kind of benchmark for measuring the political efficiency of states and societies.
And that is because people become more educated, societies become more urbanized, so why? Why are the costs rising?
This is to do with, I think, modernization processes. If you want to have an industrialized society, if you want to have mobility, geographical but also social mobility, if you want to have a society based on knowledge, then some sort of political and social participation becomes a more important factor. Let's put it like that. You can also make it functionalist and argue, like Ernest Gellner and others have done. If you want to follow this modernization course, you will sooner or later be confronted with the necessity to introduce democratic means or widening participation, because otherwise you won't be in this club of modernizing societies. You can put it like that. I just wanted to make a counter-statement to the Hobbesian idea of some sort of anthropological continuity.
So we now have pronounced the important term modernization. And we have agreed, because I would agree, that if you want to have progress at some point, you will have to introduce some elements of democratization. There is such a thing as authoritarian modernization. In short stretches of time, autocracies can modernize at surprising speed. You have also mentioned one of the most striking instances, the industrialization of Soviet Union. And indeed, if we were talking in the 30s, it would have been absolutely clear to anyone what system has the future. In the States, there was the Great Depression, the tremendous economic crisis coupled with dust storms and other signs that the country is cursed. And at the same time, in the Soviet Union, there was spectacular industrial growth, the rapid rates of urbanization, also mass killings, which produce an impression of public energy, especially at a long distance. So, of course, it would have been evident to anyone that the socialist, the communist model has every possible advantage. But then, in a decade or so, it turned out to be not so clear-cut. But what I want to proceed on is this. Authoritarian modernization is possible, I think, first, for a short time, comparatively, historically speaking, short time, and especially if you are doing it at a certain historical period. Autocracies are good in concentrating resources, as we have stated. So if you do this kind of great leap thing, it's better to be an autocrat. But then comes your tipping point, especially if you want to progress from an industrial to a post-industrial society and economy. If you have a situation where the majority of your people are no longer working either in agriculture or in industry as peasants or workers, but they are now city dwellers who work in management, various services, what we call creative areas, etc., then indeed, at some point, they will come to you demanding more civil and political rights. And then you have a choice, you an autocrat. If you are an autocrat at that moment, you either can, if you want to proceed with your modernizing game, you'll have to share power, because all those demands, again, boil down to one thing: recon with us. Do not make decisions without asking us. We have to have a say. So you either can agree and share perhaps a bit of your power with these people, or you can remember that you are, after all, an autocrat, so your chief business is staying in power, not producing economic growth. So you can roll the whole thing backward. This is, roughly speaking, what happened in Russia in 2012. We are now making great jumps across the road of history, but that is necessitated by our subject itself. So that was, in my opinion, as a political scientist, as a Russia watcher, that was the tipping point. That was the moment of choice when political elites could have decided that some power sharing wouldn't harm them, but would allow them to proceed on the road of economic growth and economic development, and also keep them in the globalized powers club. But a different choice was made. The conservative trend, which is actually an authoritarian trend, started then, and we've been happily rolling with it since that moment. But now comes perhaps another question, which may which may make us doubt the notion that modernization brings democracy. New technologies, which were seen as something that can promote democratization, because these new technologies, informational technologies, provide access to information, new opportunities for connectivity, new chances for social organization and self-organization and individual initiative, also give tools to autocrats, such as they have not been able to enjoy before. So, surveillance, censorship, and propaganda being reinforced by new informational technologies make the use of violence, well, not perhaps less necessary, but they make the use of mass violence less necessary. You don't have to kill people off by thousands. If you can terrorize them by providing an example that will then be amplified by media, by social media, by the whole noosphere, to use Vernadsky term, of modern information field. So, it used to be the argument that China can provide an example of both technological advance and economic growth without democracy. Russia has certainly not provided such an example. Any tangible economic growth has stopped since 2013, and whatever case and war economy we are enjoying right now, it is certainly not a valid economic growth model. But China, again, used to be an example for all those people who claimed that democracy is not so necessary for that it's not the only model that can give you better life, economic growth, and bring millions of people out of poverty. See? We were told China can do that without resorting to democratization. I think that the Chinese example has somehow lost some of its luster recently because of the internal problems that China is struggling with. What I'm curious to see, again, as a political scientist, is how it will work out with China breaking its own power transfer mechanism, which they used to enjoy within the limits of the party autocracy. Chinese model is a party autocracy, which is more long-lived statistically than personalized autocracies like Russian one, because you can, of course, educate the next generation of the elite within the framework of your ruling party, and you can also, by using the two terms rule, get rid of your leadership without resorting to violence. Now that rule is no longer. And we are going to see how that plays out. But the question that I'm going to pose is not exactly about China, it's more about technologies and the belief that they work for the good of humanity or not. Democracy used to be coupled with a belief in progress. And progress, at least since the 19th century, was understood as a technological progress. So science and technology is going to make people's lives better, and it is going simultaneously to bring democracy to more countries than previously. But now I can perceive that both in Europe and in the United States, techno-pessimism is more a thing than techno-optimism. That is curious, because if we look at the global polls, then the so-called second world countries tend to come out as more techno-optimistic. They have more belief in technology, which is perhaps easy to explain because they have evident signs that their life is becoming better. You didn't have landline telephones, but now you have mobile phones. And this is why, by the way, perhaps that technology is more advanced in the so-called developing countries than sometimes even in the first world countries. But again, my question is not exactly about that, but about this decoupling of belief in progress with the belief in democracy. It is perhaps curious that you have mentioned that in passing, that today the future is seen as open, but very few people see it as potentially bringing any good. How have we become so pessimistic? Why has technology become a scare rather than a hope?
You've touched upon two things I would like to comment on. The first is the relation between political change, political progress, political modernization, and economic modernization. And as a historian, I would be skeptical that this coupling of political and economic modernization was really synchronized in any society. I mean, there are master narratives that tell you that was possible. This is the master narrative of Britain in the 19th century, and it's in a way the master narrative of the United States in the 20th century. A coupling of democratization and economic success. And these narratives have been really very suggestive, but these developments are uneven. They produce crises. And you have social crises and you have crises of political participation during the very successful industrial development of both Britain and the US. So I would be very careful not to believe these narratives. But what these narratives produce are very suggestive images how the world should be. In the 19th century, the idea is that if you introduce free trade, you will make the world democratic. And if you believe in the fact that democracies don't wage war against each other, then this free trade, democratic world will be a peaceful world. And of course, the 19th and 20th century is full of wars and full of authoritarian and democratic waves of development, as we have seen. If you look at the 20th century, the Americans invite a lot of students from China to come to Harvard or to Princeton or to Stanford, and the argument is they will learn what democracy is, and then they will go back to their countries, to their authoritarian countries, and will change them for good. So if we invite them to come to our free universities, they will learn what progress, what political democratic progress actually means, and that will change the world. And the important thing is, when I was in Harvard for the last time, and I met Chinese academics, postdocs, they said, this American program doesn't work any longer. Because we go here to study political science or history, but we don't do that from a perspective of deficiency or being backward, but we study a dying political culture that had the best time that had its best time already, and we know that the Chinese will dominate the 21st century. So the idea of a kind of American progress brought to the world doesn't fit into these young people's world any longer. So the idea of political and economic modernization working hand in hand is a very fragile one. And I think there is hardly any authoritarian regime in the world that does not concentrate on this aspect. China, in a way, wins political capital by arguing we can be very capitalist and very successful capitalist, but we don't need democracy or human rights. So what we see is a very systematic decoupling of these processes. And against the background of these very successful decoupling processes, the Western narrative of synchronicity, of democratization and economic modernization looks very old-fashioned. Your second point is about technology, and that's really a very important factor, because for me as a historian, all major revolutions in world history have to do with technology and media. No reformation without Gutenberg's invention. No American or French revolution without media, new media developing. No 1848 without the steam-driven printing press. No Arab Spring without the smartphone. So, yes, you are right. At the moment, it seems as if technology plays into the hands of authoritarian regimes. But I must say, having experienced as a student in West Germany the late GDR and its obsession with using the most advanced technology in order to control and discipline a society, has made me very reluctant to believe that authoritarian regimes can really capitalize on technology. They might be able, but technology can also be used to, in a way, put these regimes in a very defensive position. For all the GDR's investment in modern technology to secure the existence of the GDR, it didn't help in 1989, and it all collapsed. So I'm a bit skeptical. Maybe it is rather the same factor or the same constellation we observed when talking about democracy and authoritarian renaissance. These things go in waves. And an authoritarian ruler who believes that he has the ultimate instrument, the ultimate technological instrument to control a whole society might be on the defensive just a couple of months later when a new technology is invented that allows him or allows other parts of societies to circumvent that. So technology is a very ambivalent instrument for political regimes. It can be used for more participation, mobilization, resource acting, but it can also be used for repression, even terror, no doubt. But it's difficult to use just one function.
I would like to come back to the concept of waves, because this is what we have started with, and this is the idea that has cropped up several times during our conversation. You said that democratization comes in waves, and there's always a backward trend after the wave of democratization. I personally rather suspect that the modern idea that autocracy is on the rise has been fed on unrealistic expectations based in their turn on rapid and massive democratization of the mid-80s and 90s. Because of the weakening and finally collapse of the Soviet Union, so many countries became democratic all at once that this fostered unrealistic expectations. You just could not go on at that rate from there. There ought to have been at least a slowing down of this process and then perhaps a kind of backward trend. But my question would be, if we are in this backward trend right now, do you as a historian perceive, for example, that democratization waves are getting longer and closer together, or the other way around? And those backward waves, that's an awkward term to use, but whatever you may come up with, are getting shorter, or again, they're getting longer. So my question is, will there be a fourth wave? And if yes, why? If yes, when?
Never ask a historian to predict the future. They
have trouble predicting the past.
Yeah, I'm just doing my job, looking at things past. But no. Of course, I mean, you do analyze historical processes in order to better understand the present. It's not an antiquarian interest we have in history. We want to use it to better understand our present, or maybe even to talk about more or less plausible developments in the foreseeable future. One thing which you've mentioned is really important, and that is the idea after 1989, 1990, 91, that there was an unstoppable progress towards democracy and capitalism. And I think that has led to, back to Tocqueville, to a revolution of rising expectations. And now that we see the problems in a lot of cases, maybe also a lot of very visible cases, very prominent cases such as China or India or Brazil or Russia, we tend to overlook how many democracies which came into political existence at the end of the Cold War have grown into relatively stable democracies. We should, for instance, look at, I mean, I'm not saying it's perfect, but we should look at Czechoslovakia. We should look at South Korea. We could even look at Poland, because Poland is an example that the history does not stop with peace and the onslaught to destroy the Supreme Court, but that regression can be answered by resilience with all the problems involved. And in a way, we have seen it in Brazil as well. I'm not saying this is the beginning of a fourth wave of democratization, because the problems, the challenges for democratic regimes in the near future might be different ones from those in other past waves. So that I think is a real difference. And what we see now is maybe one additional factor, and that is a kind of constant global comparison made possible by modern technologies. If people in the 19th century or in the early 20th century talked about authoritarian regimes or democracy, they would concentrate very much on their own society. They might be interested in some neighbors, but it was not a global comparison, whereas in our days, we constantly compare on a global level, and that causes a lot of stress in a way.
We know too much, right?
In a way, we know too much and too little at the same time. We are overwhelmed by news, information, fake news, and whatever, and it's really difficult to digest all of that. Now, this is the moment where I want to introduce one concept, and that is the concept of trust or confidence. If you study sociology, you might have come across the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, who argues that trust or confidence, trust is some sort of thing coupled with individuals, human actors. Confidence is systematic, institutional, an institutional matter. You trust in the Bundesbank or the Supreme Court, or you trust the Chancellor or a member of Parliament. Now, the important thing, whether you talk about trust or confidence, is it reduces complexity. If you don't trust, you become victim of information, news, fake news, and you are no longer able to say, is it true or is it not true? You are left alone, and you become victim of a complexity that you cannot handle. From that point of view, it is rational to trust. And the problem of, or the mean thing about authoritarian regimes is that by weakening trust in political institutions, they make
including
people,
surprisingly their own.
Exactly. They make people vulnerable for not being able to judge whether a news, is a fake news, is an information, is an opinion. And my analysis would be that we are much more defined by this problem in comparison with past societies that, of course, were also media societies, but not to the same extent which we see nowadays. And my guess is that if there is a fourth wave of democratic resilience, it will be very much under the impression of a new kind of media and communication channels. And I think that is something we need to bear in mind.
That's an interesting concept. I have not come across it, so thank you for drawing my attention to it. This could explain the sad fact that people who say we don't trust, for example, mainstream media because they are prejudiced, their next step is to trust to an astrological forecast or tarot cards or to the first mountebank they encounter on the wide fields of internet. So they, in a sense, become much more trustful, much more gullible, because they now lack trust in the institutions. So yes, it's rational rather than irrational to have institutional trust. And it is also very true that autocracies, especially the autocracies of today, are less anxious to advertise their own excellence of their own institutions, but to say that everybody is the same, everybody is bad enough, so you are better off rooting for your own team. There is perhaps no democracy anywhere, so why bother? And this brings us to the question that I have initially asked you, and that with which we may conclude our part of the discussion, so that we can proceed to the questions from the audience. And that is this point about the fourth wave. You said that we perhaps know both too much and too little. We tend to concentrate on what we are being told in the news. People in the past did not compare their own development with China's, but now we have to put China in the picture. And at the same time, and that is about knowing too little, we perhaps tend to miss the quiet changes that are not being publicized in the news. Of course, the big countries like Russia and China matter because they're not just big in themselves, they also influence their immediate surrounding. There's a theory for that. Political science has a theory for everything, so it is called, in Levitsky and Wei's book, it's called Black Knight and White Knight. So if you are a democratic country, your neighbors tend to have more chances to democratize and vice versa. But we miss the points where other countries like Mongolia are now competitive democracies. But since they are not in the news, they do not help to form these coherent, perhaps too coherent pictures, these narratives where there's a dramatic story. Look how democracies all over the world are failing. Look how the West is disintegrating. Look how everyone now is an autocrat, and that everyone is 1, 2, 3 people whom media attention is concentrated on, not without a reason, but still it does not give us the full picture. So, to conclude, you said that you won't be tricked into the trap of making predictions. I dislike that extremely as well. But we political scientists get asked about it a lot. But I perhaps can afford to conclude with something of an working hypothesis about this possible fourth wave. I think we have more or less agreed that democracy is no less natural than an autocracy. We have refused to see authoritarian rule as a kind of anthropological necessity, a given, a kind of norm from which democracy is an exception. Perhaps democratizing instinct is as much a natural thing as this authoritarian instinct. So, modern autocracies that rely so much on technology, on information or rather disinformation, that, as the phrase goes, are based on 20% of violence and 80% of propaganda, not vice versa, as in the 20th century, also have this curious tendency to try to get rid of as many institutions as they can lay their hands on, and so become more personalized. I mentioned China as an example. It was a highly institutionalized autocracy. Again, party autocracy is the best type of autocracy if you want to live for a long time. No one asked my advice of how to become a long-lived autocracy, but I'm giving it for free, unsolicited. But now they've broken that mechanism. Russia has become more and more of a personalized, I don't like the term dictatorship, but yes, it's a highly solidified authoritarian regime that is centered on a person. This is simple to do, it's easy to do, and this model seems sometimes almost unassailable in its primitiveness. But it has one drawback, and that's a very evident one. If you concentrate everything, if you finalize every decision-making process in one person, that person is still human. So the moment will come, and that is not necessarily the moment for democratization, but it is certainly a window for change. I would suspect that now with the what is called current geopolitical situation, when Russia and Iran have so surprisingly forged an alliance, perhaps the domino effect will happen when the more aging Iran leadership will start to die off. And that may prove to be a tipping point. Because while the Russian gerontocrats are aged 70 plus, those in Iran are 80 plus. Well, in other countries we also have glaring examples of aging leadership, but I would almost say introduce a racist point. different people live different terms and have varying states of health. So, sadly, these biopolitical factors are important if we are dealing with a personalized autocracy. So, this will be, I think, my rather vague, maybe intentionally vague, concluding point, so we may proceed, or would you want to say a few words as a conclusion?
Just very briefly, I agree. This is the one weak point about a lot of authoritarian regimes, their dependency on individual actors that lose contact to reality, and you can see it in China and in Russia, and begin to interpret history as a mirror of their own biographical lifetime. That can make you very nervous if you look at China, because one of Xi Jinping's main aims is to correct what has gone wrong in 1949. And 2049 might be, from the politics of history, a very important last date to annex Taiwan, and a lot of China experts look very nervous to this perspective. But your point is right, and this, in a way, is a historical repetition. You can see it in the person of Alexander the Great, you see it in Napoleon, you see it in Adolf Hitler, in Stalin. The inability to imagine a world after one's own life. Very often this is coupled with the question of war and peace. But the point I would like to stress at the very end of this discussion is really that the end of democracy and the start of authoritarian regimes does not take place on barricades any longer. It's not something defined by coups d'etats, by burning presidential palaces or tanks in front of buildings. That might happen, but it's...
Yeah, perhaps one might give it a try.
One might give it a try, but...
Don't be dismissive.
But the main point is really that authoritarian regimes in the 20th and 21st century have been very successful in developing subtle ways of transfers of power. And as a historian, I don't want to look at, or I don't want to wait until the enabling law, the collapse of checks and balances, but rather I would look at the wrong alliances. When do, for instance, conservative parties begin to think that they can use populist measures in order to tame a right-wing extremist, but in order to profit from the popularity of such a trend? This is what happened in Italy during the rise of Mussolini. This is the German conservatives look at Hitler. We can tame him, we can use his popularity, and once he's in power, we can control him. And this has gone, usually this has gone wrong. And this is an important point in democratic regimes if they are challenged by authoritarian regimes. So not to wait until the enabling law has taken place, but to look at the crisis of confidence and the critical moment of the wrong alliances. So I think that was my point. And now I think the floor is open. We have a micro that can be used, and we have approximately 20 minutes or so to ask questions.
Just 1 second.
I really appreciate, I don't know, is that working? Yeah. I appreciated the point made by Dr. Schulmann about the characteristic of democracy being that a peaceful transfer of power can take place. Also the point made by Dr. Leonhard that de Tocqueville had 3 basic criteria that he identified for what needs to exist in a democracy. My question to both of you is, what are the conditions in democratic societies which make the regression to authoritarianism more likely? I say that because over the last 30 years, it seemed like a large number of societies were becoming more democratic, and now we see a reverse position. What are, in fact, the reasons within democratic societies which explain that regression? Thank you.
Yeah, I can offer you my version. First, no society is immune from an authoritarian tendency. It's not a virus that comes from outside. I don't think it actually is a virus. It's a tendency that is always there. When I explain different political regimes to my students, I warn them from considering this democracy to totalitarianism as a kind of straight line from good to very bad, through a little worse and then worse and worse. That is not it. I think we will be more realistic if we imagine it as a kind of yin and yang thing. There's a democratic element or democratic force, and there's an authorizational tendency, and there's a balance, a sort of struggle between them, and it is going on always. So there are no signs, in my opinion, that make a society, a whole of society, a political nation, more prone to fall to an authoritarian regression. But if we look at political science, science in the development of a political system, that will make it more likely to move in the authoritarian direction. I would say this: if we have a highly unified elite, that is bad. If we have divisions in the elites, that is not good in itself. It may lead to a collapse of our political system if the struggle becomes too much for internal stability. But unity looks good on an election placard, but in reality, it leads more easily to a solidified autocracy. So if we have various interest groups that are allowed a say in a decision-making process, that is a better option. If we have one group that has won over all the others and got rid of them, that is bad. It looks kind of self-evident when you put it this way, but usually people think that if a good guy, a democratically minded guy, won, that is the best option for democracy. But really, it is not. So, a zero-sum game is a bad thing for democracy, even if your party wins. There's a phrase that is known to those who study recent Russian political history. Democracy is when Democrats are in power. No, it is not. Democracy is power sharing. Democracy is checks and balances. Democracy is having to compromise. If you need to do that, then your democracy has a chance. If you have your brilliant liberal party winning the majority in a parliament and having their own president, and that president having all the prerogatives and all the leverage he or she needs to make a country happy, that is a dangerous moment.
As a historian, I would strongly argue in favor of time. It makes a huge difference whether a democracy had enough time to prove its problem-solving capacity or not. I'm currently writing a book on the history of the 1920s and 30s, and it makes a huge difference whether democracies were newly founded after the end of empires, at the end of the First World War, and had to cope with state building, security problems, the Great Depression within 10 years, without having a kind of democratic prehistory before 1914. And for me, that's an explanation why, for instance, Britain, France to a certain extent, but also Belgium or the Netherlands, are in a better position. I'm not saying it's clear that they will survive, but they are in a better position because even in a critical moment of their democratic history, they can refer to their problem-solving capacity. That's my first point. So the generational experience that democracy works. There are political scientists who say that something like 20 years or one generation is a good start. It does, however, not mean that, for instance, in Germany, 70 years of a functioning democracy is a guarantee. It is not. It is, as Ekaterina said at the beginning, democracy is requiring constant effort and maintenance. And that makes it very hard process. In a way, it's an educational and pedagogical project. That's what Tocqueville says. You have to experience it every day. Otherwise, you will be lulled into your economic interests without talking about participation. And then you might say very basic things, a respect for functioning checks and balances, a decentralization of power. Centralization of power makes it easier for authoritarian regimes to make their way. A functioning decentralization of power is really important. I mean, we have seen that during the Corona crisis there was a lot of criticism of German federalism. I'm a big fan of German federalism with regard to possible polarizations in Berlin. If federalism had worked better after 1928, the Weimar Republic could have had a better chance to survive, I'm pretty sure. The first thing the enabling laws of the Nazis abolish is decentralization. Very important. I want to mention another point, and that's a balance between trust and confidence. That means you need the personal you can trust, but you also need the institutions you trust. And you need both, because if you have bad personnel, you need good institutions. But if you have non-working institutions, you need the personnel who repair the problem. And the last two things have been mentioned already, but I want to repeat them. No wrong alliances. Very important. Do not believe in taming the autocratic, individual, charismatic leader in order to gain from their popularity. This is a particular responsibility for conservative parties right now. If you apply the wrong alliance, if you believe you can somehow control them and channel them into your own political tendency, that could go wrong. And my last point is the Tocquevillian one. Democracy is more than political actors and political institutions. It's about habits. The French is mœurs, difficult to translate, some sort of virtue. And this kind of virtue needs daily experience. You probably know the famous word by Ernest Renan, what is the nation? And he says it's the plébiscite de tous les jours, the daily plebiscite. And I think to a certain extent he refers to something that is also important for democracy, and that is daily experience. Because then you know what is at stake if authoritarian regimes question it. You need to know what is at stake if you want to defend it. If you don't know what it really means for you, you won't be prepared to defend it.
I liked your point about experience of democracy. So basically your answer to the question how to get rich is it helps if you've been rich before. One can't object to that.
Okay.
It's very difficult to try to take a look on the present as if it is the past. But nevertheless, let me try. I have such an observation. What do you think about it? It's looks like if our autocraten have a dream to be as more Ayatollah as possible. there being, it doesn't matter, it is not very significant if it is 70 years old or 80 years old. It's not the, the decidable factor, but the wish, the dream to be on the top, to be on the hill, and to be the Tsar of the hill, and at the same time to be somewhere in the Himmel. I have forgotten the somewhere far from reality, to be as Ayatollah. Yeah, this is something which we toward the typical autocrats come at the end of their ruling, and maybe this this part of their ruling time has some perspective, some possibilities to change it anyhow. From then the institutions can, other institutions can develop probably. Well, that's my question. Is this observation that they want to be ayatollahs in the sense of the Iranian one, to be just the same on the top and somewhere else? Is it more or less, from your point of view, it is it makes sense or not? Excuse me. I haven't spoken English for 20 years, maybe.
It's all right. Of course, it's the business of every autocrat to stay in power for as long as he possibly can, and then in the best case scenario for him to hand the power to his successor, to somebody he has chosen to succeed him. The end of the so-called long rule is a specific time period. You've mentioned ayatollahs, and you've very bravely declared that it doesn't matter whether you are 70 plus or 80 plus. It does. It leaves you more or less of a time span to try to realize your autocrat's dream. But correct me if I'm wrong, but across history we have come to encounter numerous examples of these long reigns, long personal reigns. The ends of them, like the late years of Ivan the Terrible, or of Portuguese dictator Salazar, or of Stalin, or of Nicholas I of Russia, they have many striking similarities. So we have a leader who, yes, wants to stay forever, who now considers himself to be a historical figure, living historical legacy, actually living in history. What you called inhabiting his fantasy world. At the same time, he cannot help but be aware of his mortality, which puts him humiliatingly on the same level as every other mortal. And this makes him more conservative. So these last years are usually very dark years. Alexander Herzen, the Russian publicist and thinker, named this last 7 years of Nicholas I the leaden years. Свинцовые семилетия, the leaden 7 years. So sometimes you have this leader unaccountably absent, secluding himself from the world, not contacting even his nearest surroundings. Sometimes he has bouts of energy and he is on the opposite, involved, but unnaturally so, in some subject that he suddenly became interested in, be it war or be it linguistics that happened to Stalin. No one knows why. At the same time, he is less involved on a daily basis in the practical business of governing. What happens to the system that he is the head of? This system has to construct a kind of exogenous skeleton to surround the emptiness that used to be filled with the now shrinking figure of a leader. When we think about the death of a dictator, we tend to imagine it as a moment, the 5th of March, 1953 for Russian history. But before that, there's this preceding period. It can develop in, again, and here I would like to hand over the microphone to you after I formulate this. It tends to develop in, I think, two different ways. Either you have a kind of collective rule that is being tacitly formed in order to complement the receding presence of the dictator, or you have collective proxy government, or you have individual proxy government. You have a secretary, a favorite, as somebody who will later be mentioned in history as virtually ruling the country for the last 5, again, or 7 years of the rule of so-and-so. So this, if it's a collective proxy, which I think was more or less the case with the Soviet Communist Party in late Stalinist times, this is what allows this elite to regroup after the death of their beloved leader and to preserve the system. Soviet regime was never the same after the death of Stalin, but it changed, but it survived. Why? Because there was the party, because there was the Politburo, because there were those people who collected over the dead body of Comrade Stalin and made a few decisions. We will not go into details as to what decisions, but they made them and they kept their pact for quite a long time. So, in your experience as a historian, how do those long reigns end?
They can end in the way you described it, but I would like to highlight maybe a more positive alternative, and that is the end of Francoism in Spain. With the end of Franco, the non-existence of a Politburo, the whole system in a way collapses. And that factor, plus a kind of positive perspective, that is to say, bring Spain, bring Greece after the authoritarian colonels, and bring Portugal after Salazar into a kind of European integration movement, allows a very swift transition with the development of a relatively stable democracy. So you are right. Pavel, you've described it. This moment of the death of the authoritarian actor is very particular, but it can, in many cases, it in a way encapsulates the fact that this dictatorship is over, that it has survived itself, that it has no substance people believe in. Very often it's only the person that exemplifies and represents it. And once this particular actor is dead, other bonds of loyalty disintegrate. It's highly likely that we will see whether a post-Putin phase or a post-Xi Jinping phase takes this road, with an institutional continuity or a fight between competitors, some sort of Diadochenkampf, or whether it opens up if there is a positive perspective. When elites say, well, the price we pay for a continuity of this regime is maybe too high. I wouldn't be able to say whether it goes this way or that way, but the death of the dictator is a moment of openness in history. I would insist on that.
I think we have time for one more question. If we give our words, that we will give short answers.
I think that's a very last question, or where is it?
I'm really sorry.
I'm sorry. Can we wait a minute till the microphone goes to the right person?
He was asking first.
So we take the two questions brief together.
Okay.
No?
So sorry for the
I'm really sorry. I'm sorry to saying that. Two men was already asking a question. Yeah, so my question is more or less, about the waves, because for me now it looks like the future is not so bright and so on. And I mean, it should be something like scientifically, I don't know, scientifically visible that democracy will work. Because I mean, all human beings never have the experience of having democracy everywhere. So how possible it is, because really much people thought like it's just the system when some countries are rich and some countries are not, and this is like how it should be. I mean, I don't believe that, but
thank you.
Still, yeah.
Yeah. And afterwards we have to leave, unfortunately.
I was wondering what the role of the military actually is in making and breaking regimes, because I think you brought up the example of the Franco regime, and as far as I remember, I think the military actually refused to basically kill the civilians more or less, so a peaceful transfer to a democratic power was possible.
Maybe I start with this question and then you could say something on the democracy. Very important factor. I could say, the question was, what are factors for democracies if they want to survive? Don't let the military become a state within the state. Make sure that there is a civilian control of the military that works. The fact that the military in the Weimar Republic was a state within the state became a huge burden. It's not an accident that the last chancellor before Adolf Hitler is appointed is a former general, and that you could apply to a lot of other factors. But I still hold that the use of open military power is less likely in many transitions from democracies to authoritarian regimes, and that we find other ways of transfers of power. So democracy is not only challenged when tanks drive to presidential palaces like Allende and Pinochet in Chile in 1973, but look at the other points I've mentioned. But ultimately, the role of the military as a state within the state, as its own system, as is the case in the People's Republic of China or in Russia, is obviously very important. No doubt about that.
Let me put in a good word for the military suddenly. In some countries of Northern Africa or Latin America, even military coups have been stages towards democratization. If in your country, military, the officers are the most educated part of society and the most westernized, they can put an end to a personalized dictatorship. That is not to advertise military coups in any way, but just to show that situations can be different. A security service can be of higher danger to democracy than even the military, because an army is a democratic institution in a sense that it's a people's institution. It's big, and it provides a social lift. But secret police, political police, is small by its nature, secretive by its nature, anti-democratic by its nature. So, if you're in such a bad place that you have a fight between the military and the secret police, side with the military. But I hope you don't get there ever. Now to the question about the democratization waves and how real they are. Are they bound to happen? Well, we don't have a timetable for human history till the end of the world. Marx had it. Many other philosophers also thought they knew God's plan for humanity, but we don't presume to know this kind of thing. However, we do perceive a certain tendency which manifests itself in these democratization waves. Let me put it this way. So long as we have urban life, general literacy, and economies which are based less on physical labor than on service, management, and intellectual labor, you will have democratizing trend that can result in a wave of democratization. And why is it a wave? Because countries influence each other. That is the safest formula I can come up with by the end of this, at least to me, highly fascinating discussion. Thank you all very much for your attention and for your intelligent questions. And thank you for what has been, for me, a highly educational experience.
Thank you. Thank you.